There's a moment in history where a single engineering project, a railroad, managed to do something that no army, no navy, and no diplomatic ultimatum had achieved on its own. It drew the invisible lines of a coming war. It turned old friends into bitter enemies. It pushed nations that had spent centuries despising each other into reluctant alliance. And it did all of this before a single shot was fired. In the summer of 1914, that project was the Baghdad Railway, sometimes called the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, a colossal German-financed rail line designed to slice through the crumbling Ottoman Empire and connect the heart of industrial Europe to the oil-rich shores of the Persian Gulf. On the surface, it looked like progress, a faster route to the east, trade, development, modernization. But beneath the steel and timber, the Baghdad Railway was something else entirely. It was a weapon, not of war, but of economic domination. And every major power in Europe recognized it as such. Britain saw it as a dagger aimed at the Suez Canal, at India, at the very arteries of their empire. Russia saw it as a wall rising between them and the warm waters they had coveted for generations. France saw it as a betrayal of Ottoman debt arrangements they had carefully cultivated for decades. And Germany, the ambitious newcomer to the imperial stage, saw the railway as nothing less than the key to their future as a true world power. The Baghdad Railway did not cause World War I by itself. No single event ever does. But it accelerated the forces that made the war inevitable. It hardened alliances, deepened suspicions, and created a geopolitical chessboard in the Middle East that we are still navigating over a century later. So, let me take you back to the late 1800s, when a dying empire, a hungry Kaiser, and a railroad concession set the fuse for the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. To understand the Baghdad Railway, you first need to understand the state of Europe and the Ottoman Empire in the final decades of the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, was now openly referred to as the sick man of Europe. It was hemorrhaging territory, it was drowning in debt, and every great power on the continent was circling like vultures, waiting for the corpse to finally stop breathing. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 had been catastrophic. The Ottomans lost massive chunks of territory in the Balkans, and more importantly, they were left financially shattered. By 1881, the empire was so deep in debt to European creditors that a new institution, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, was established. And here's the critical detail. This institution was run not by the Ottomans, but by representatives of the very European powers the empire owed money to, primarily Britain and France. So, the empire's own finances were essentially in foreign hands. The Sultan could not spend his own revenues without the approval of foreign accountants sitting in his capital. Now, imagine the humiliation of that. You are the ruler of an empire that once stretched from Vienna to the gates of Persia, and now British and French bankers are telling you how much of your own tax revenue you are allowed to keep. Into this atmosphere of decline and desperation walked a new player, the German Empire. Germany in the late 1800s was a nation on fire with ambition. It had only been unified in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck, and in the span of just 2 decades, it had transformed itself from a patchwork of feudal states into the most powerful industrial economy in continental Europe. German steel production skyrocketed from roughly 950,000 tons in 1886 to an astonishing 13 million tons by 1910. German factories were churning out machinery, chemicals, and armaments at a pace that rivaled and in some cases surpassed Britain. But Germany had a problem. It was late to the colonial game. Britain had India, vast holdings in Africa, dominance over global sea routes. France had North Africa, Indochina, extensive railway investments in the Ottoman Levant. Russia was swallowing Central Asia whole and eyeing Persia with naked hunger. Germany had some colonies in Africa and the Pacific, but nothing that matched the scale of its industrial ambitions. The nation needed markets for its goods, sources of raw materials, and strategic depth, the kind that comes from having economic footholds beyond Europe. And so, Germany looked east, not to the scramble in Africa, where the best territories were already claimed, but to the Ottoman Empire, a vast, underdeveloped, resource-rich territory where European influence was already deep, but where no single power had total control. The Ottomans, for their part, were looking for a new friend. Britain had effectively taken Egypt from them. France was meddling in Syria and Lebanon. Russia was their ancient enemy to the north. Germany, by contrast, had no colonial presence in Ottoman lands, no history of territorial seizure, and crucially, it had the industrial capacity and the financial muscle the Ottomans desperately needed. It was a marriage of convenience, and the Baghdad Railway was its dowry. The idea of a railway connecting Constantinople to Baghdad and beyond to the Persian Gulf was not a German invention. The concept had been floating around since the 1830s, when a British officer named Francis Chesney surveyed the Euphrates River valley and proposed a route to India that bypassed the long sea voyage around Africa. The British government studied the idea, but ultimately decided it was too risky and too expensive, given the political instability of Ottoman Mesopotamia. The French, meanwhile, had already built the famous Orient Express, connecting Paris to Constantinople by rail. They also operated several railway lines in the Ottoman Levant, in modern-day Syria and Lebanon, and they considered the Eastern Mediterranean their sphere of commercial influence. But it was a German engineer named Wilhelm von Pressel who truly gave the Baghdad Railway its form. Pressel was retained by the Ottoman government in 1872 to develop plans for railways across Turkey. He spent years surveying the terrain, studying the mountain passes of the Taurus and Amanus ranges, and developing detailed proposals. Pressel was a visionary. He saw the railway not just as a commercial venture, but as a transformative force that could modernize the Ottoman Empire, develop its agricultural interior, and bind its far-flung provinces together. After the devastating loss of the Russo-Turkish War, Sultan Abdul Hamid II became increasingly receptive to the idea. The railway, he believed, could help reassert Ottoman control over its Arabian territories and provide a strategic alternative to the sea routes that were dominated by the British Royal Navy. In 1888, the Sultan granted a concession to a syndicate led by Georg von Siemens, the managing director of Deutsche Bank, and Alfred von Kaula, a director of the Württembergische Vereinsbank. Together, they formed the Anatolian Railway Company and began extending an existing British-built line from Haidar Pasha on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus inland to Ankara. The Ankara line was completed by the end of 1892, and a second concession was granted to extend the railway further south to Konya, which was finished by 1896. These early lines ran efficiently and on time. They generated goodwill with the Ottoman Ministry of Public Works and established Deutsche Bank as the dominant foreign railway operator in Anatolia. And buried in the original concession was a clause that would change history. An agreement by the Anatolian Railway Company to consider extending the line all the way to Baghdad at some future date. That future date was approaching faster than anyone anticipated. In 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm II made a state visit to the Ottoman Empire that was as much a spectacle of imperial theater as it was a diplomatic mission. The Kaiser arrived in Constantinople with an entourage of over 500 officials, military personnel, and servants. He sailed the Bosphorus in his imperial yacht, the Hohenzollern, and met privately with Sultan Abdul Hamid. But the visit did not end in Constantinople. The Kaiser traveled on to Haifa, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Beirut, and finally Damascus, where he delivered one of the most consequential speeches of his career. Germany was not just seeking trade concessions in the Ottoman Empire. It was positioning itself as a political and spiritual ally of the Islamic world, a direct challenge to British and French colonial authority over Muslim populations in Egypt, North Africa, India, and beyond. During the same visit, the Sultan offered the Kaiser something extraordinary: the chance to extend the railway from Konya through Baghdad all the way to Basra in the Persian Gulf. It was the ultimate prize. A rail line stretching roughly 1,600 kilometers through the heart of Mesopotamia, connecting European industry to the oil fields and waterways of the ancient world. Georg von Siemens at Deutsche Bank was initially skeptical. He understood the enormous engineering challenges, the political risks, and the sheer cost of building through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. In a moment of frustration, he reportedly said he could not care less about the concession or the entire Baghdad railway. The political obstacles were that severe. In fact, Siemens was so exasperated that he offered the project to the Russian finance minister, Sergei Witte, at the beginning of 1899. Witte declined. But the Kaiser was not a man who accepted refusal easily. German ambassador Freiherr Marschall von Bieberstein pressured Siemens to sign the preliminary concession, despite his reservations. After Siemens died in 1901, his successor at Deutsche Bank, Arthur von Gwinner, took over the project and proved far more enthusiastic. On the 27th of November 1899, Sultan Abdul Hamid formally granted the concession to the German-dominated Anatolian Railway Company. The terms were staggering: a 99-year lease, Ottoman government guarantees of a minimum 4% annual return on capital invested, mining rights within a 20-kilometer zone on each side of the tracks, the right to build and operate ports at Baghdad, Basra, and the Persian Gulf terminus, and exclusive rights to all branch lines within that corridor. The formal contract establishing the Baghdad Railway Company was signed in March of 1903, and construction officially began. Now, here is where we need to stop and examine exactly what was at stake. Because the Baghdad Railway was far more than a construction project. It was a direct challenge to the existing global order, and every major power understood this immediately. Start with Britain. The British Empire in 1903 was the most powerful entity on Earth. Its navy ruled the seas, its colonial holdings spanned every continent, and its strategic lifeline, the thing that held the whole system together, was the Suez Canal. Opened in 1869 and effectively under British control since 1875, when Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli used Rothschild financing to purchase the Egyptian Khedive's shares, the Suez Canal was the fastest route from Europe to India to Southeast Asia to Australia to the Far East. Whoever controlled the Suez Canal controlled global trade. The Baghdad Railway threatened to make the canal irrelevant. A completed rail line from Berlin to Baghdad to Basra would offer a land-based alternative to the Suez, one that Germany controlled and that Britain could not blockade with its navy. Goods, troops, and strategic materials could flow from Central Europe to the Persian Gulf without ever touching a British-controlled waterway. But the threat went deeper than trade routes. By 1901, German survey teams had reported vast supplies of petroleum in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. One report described the region as a lake of petroleum with seemingly limitless supply. Oil was rapidly becoming the most strategically important commodity on Earth. The British Royal Navy, under the leadership of First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, was in the process of converting its fleet from coal to oil-fired engines, a decision that made access to Persian Gulf oil a matter of national survival. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become British Petroleum, was already operating in what is now southwestern Iran. A German railway terminating at the Persian Gulf, with mining rights along its entire length, would put Germany within striking distance of these oil fields and give it an independent supply of petroleum that Britain could not control. Lord Lansdowne, the British Foreign Secretary, was blunt. In a statement to the House of Commons in 1903, he declared that Britain would view the establishment of a naval base or fortified port in the Persian Gulf by any other country as a serious threat to British interests, and that Britain would resist it with all available means. The message was aimed squarely at Berlin. The British response to the Baghdad Railway was not limited to angry speeches in Parliament. It was strategic, calculated, and ultimately transformative for the entire map of the Middle East. First, in 1899, the same year the railway concession was granted to Germany, Britain moved to establish a protectorate over Kuwait. This was not a coincidence. Kuwait sat at the head of the Persian Gulf, exactly where the Baghdad Railway was projected to terminate. By bringing Kuwait under British protection, London effectively blocked the railway's southern endpoint. The Sheikh of Kuwait, Mubarak al-Sabah, signed an agreement with Britain promising not to cede any territory or receive any foreign agent without British consent. It was a small treaty with enormous consequences. Without access to a deep-water port on the Gulf, the economic viability of the entire railway was in question. Second, the British government worked behind the scenes to undermine financing for the project. Deutsche Bank needed British and French capital to complete the line. The engineering challenges alone were enormous. The Taurus Mountains, rising to over 3,700 meters, required a series of 12 tunnels with a combined length of over 7 miles, along with concrete viaducts and elevated bridges through some of the most rugged terrain in Western Asia. The Amanaz Mountains demanded an 8-kilometer tunnel between Iran Station and Fevzi Pasha. These were not problems that could be solved cheaply. Kaiser Wilhelm even traveled to London in 1899 to personally ask his grandmother, Queen Victoria, for British financial participation. Deutsche Bank made repeated approaches to British banks, particularly the House of Rothschild and Barings, but the British government quietly discouraged any involvement. French interest was equally lukewarm. Paris had its own railway investments in the Ottoman Levant and had no desire to fund a competitor that would draw trade away from French-controlled ports in Syria. And here, something fascinating happened behind the curtain. Russian diplomats, who saw the railway as a threat to their ambitions in Persia and the wider Near East, actively fed stories to sympathetic British journalists to encourage opposition to the project. According to Sir Clinton Dawkins, one of the lead British negotiators, Russian embassy instigation bore significant responsibility for the collapse of British participation talks. Russian correspondents planted articles in British publications like the National Review, stoking fears about German expansion in the threat to India. It was an early and remarkably effective disinformation campaign. The diplomatic fallout from the Baghdad Railway did not just strain individual relationships between nations, it fundamentally reshaped the alliance system of Europe in ways that made world war not just possible, but probable. Consider the situation in the early 1900s. Britain and France had been rivals for centuries. They had fought each other in wars from the 100 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars. They nearly went to war over colonial disputes in Africa as recently as the Fashoda incident of 1898. Britain and Russia were even deeper adversaries. The Great Game, their decades-long struggle for influence in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Persia, had brought them to the brink of conflict multiple times. The idea that these three powers would form an alliance against Germany would have seemed absurd in 1890. But the Baghdad Railway changed the calculus entirely. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale. While the agreement primarily resolved colonial disputes in Egypt and Morocco, its deeper purpose was to create a diplomatic framework that would allow both nations to cooperate against growing German influence.
influence that the Baghdad Railway symbolized more than almost anything else. Then, in 1907, Britain and Russia signed the Anglo-Russian Convention. This agreement divided Persia into spheres of influence, with Russia controlling the north and Britain controlling the south, with a neutral buffer zone in between. It also settled disputes over Afghanistan and Tibet, but again, the underlying motivation was strategic.
The agreement was explicitly aimed to outflank the German Empire, which was threatening to establish a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad and align the Ottoman Empire with Germany. The Anglo-Russian Convention completed the formation of the Triple Entente, bringing together Britain, France, and Russia in a loose but significant alignment that stood directly opposite the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. This is the architecture that defined World War I, and the Baghdad Railway was one of the primary catalysts that built it. Two nations that had spent the better part of a century as bitter rivals in Central Asia, Britain and Russia, set aside their differences and joined together because a German railroad in Mesopotamia scared them both more than each other. Meanwhile, the actual construction of the Baghdad Railway was proving to be an engineering nightmare wrapped in a financial headache. After the concession was formalized in 1903, the Baghdad Railway Company, a German bank-controlled outfit operating under Turkish law, began laying tracks southward from Konya. The construction firm Philip Holtzmann handled much of the physical building work. Progress through the Anatolian plateau was relatively straightforward. The terrain was flat, the soil was workable, and labor was available from local populations. But as the line approached the Taurus Mountains, everything changed. The Taurus Range was a wall of limestone and granite that rose between the Anatolian interior and the Mediterranean coastal plain. The original plan had called for a single long tunnel through the mountains, but geological surveys revealed that the rock formations were too varied and too unstable for that approach. Instead, engineers had to design and bore 12 separate tunnels connected by concrete viaducts and elevated bridges that spanned deep gorges and river valleys. The total length of the tunnels exceeded 7 miles. The viaducts alone stretched for over 360 yards. Most of the boring had to be done through solid limestone, and in sections where the rock was less stable, concrete lining had to be poured to prevent collapse. The work was slow, expensive, and dangerous. Beyond the Taurus lay the Amanus Mountains, which presented their own set of challenges. The Ottoman government had insisted that the railway route stay inland, away from the Mediterranean coast, to keep the line beyond the range of British naval guns. This strategic decision added hundreds of kilometers to the route and forced the engineers to bore the massive 8-kilometer tunnel through the Amanus Range. This single tunnel consumed years of labor and enormous quantities of capital. Financial difficulties compounded the engineering problems. Deutsche Bank had expected British and French participation to help cover costs, but after the diplomatic failures of 1903, they were largely on their own. The Ottoman government's kilometric guarantees, which promised to make up any shortfall in the railway's revenue, were viewed with deep suspicion in Paris and London. British and French officials feared that if the Ottoman government fell too deeply into debt to the Baghdad Railway Company, it would effectively become a German satellite, with Constantinople locked into Berlin's political and economic orbit. By 1914, when war broke out, the railway was still approximately 300 miles short of completion. The sections through the Taurus and Amanus Mountains were only partially finished, creating critical gaps in the line that would have devastating military consequences during the war itself. The irony is brutal. The very project that helped start the war was never completed in time to be fully useful during it. But the Baghdad Railway's impact on the war went far beyond its physical tracks. It shaped the Ottoman Empire's decision to enter the conflict on the side of the Central Powers, a decision that opened entirely new fronts and extended the war across the Middle East, North Africa, and into the Caucasus. The German-Ottoman relationship that the railway had cemented over 2 decades meant that when war came, the Ottomans had powerful incentives to side with Berlin. German military advisors had been embedded in the Ottoman army since the 1880s. German officers trained Ottoman troops, reorganized Ottoman military institutions, and supplied the empire with modern weapons and equipment. The railway itself, even in its incomplete state, served as a crucial supply line. The section from Constantinople through Anatolia, while interrupted by the mountain tunnel gaps, still allowed Germany to funnel weapons, ammunition, and military advisors to the Ottoman front. During the Gallipoli campaign of 1915, when British and Australian forces attempted to seize the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, the partially completed railway played an important role in resupplying Ottoman defenders. Had the full line from Constantinople to Baghdad been operational, the Ottoman Empire might have been far better able to resist the British advance during the Mesopotamian campaign, which ultimately saw British forces capture Baghdad in 1917. The war also brought a grim new dimension to the railway's legacy. The construction zones through eastern Anatolia became corridors of forced labor and death marches during the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1916. Tens of thousands of Armenian deportees were driven along railway construction routes, forced to labor in brutal conditions, and left to die in the Syrian desert. German engineers and railway workers witnessed these atrocities firsthand, and some documented them in letters and reports sent back to Berlin. The railway that was supposed to bring progress and modernization to the Ottoman interior instead became a road of unimaginable suffering. The aftermath of the war confirmed everything the railway's opponents had feared, and more. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Its territories were carved up by the victorious Allied powers in a series of agreements and mandates that drew the borders of the modern Middle East. Britain took control of Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, and of Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. The oil fields of Mesopotamia, the very resources the Baghdad Railway had been designed to access, fell into British hands. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company expanded its operations, and Britain became the dominant petroleum power in the region for the next several decades. Germany lost everything. Its railway concessions were voided, its investments were wiped out. Deutsche Bank wrote off the entire project as a loss. The physical infrastructure of the railway, those tunnels through the Taurus and Amanus mountains, those bridges and viaducts built with German engineering and German capital, now serve the strategic interests of the very powers that had opposed the project from the beginning. The final leg of the railway, connecting the remaining gaps through southeastern Turkey into Iraq, was not completed until 1940, more than 3 decades after the war that the railway had helped to ignite. And here is perhaps the most haunting echo of the entire story. The strategic logic of the Baghdad Railway never actually went away. In 2023, the Iraqi government announced a $17 billion infrastructure project called the Development Road, a rail and highway corridor running from the new Al-Fa deepwater port on the Persian Gulf northward through Iraq to the Turkish border. The project explicitly invokes the Berlin to Baghdad model. Its purpose is the same: to create a land-based trade corridor between the Gulf and Europe that shortcuts the Suez Canal. The geography has not changed. The oil is still there. The strategic calculations are still the same. A century later, nations are still fighting over the same routes, the same resources, and the same choke points. What makes the Baghdad Railway such a compelling case study is that it reveals how economic ambitions and strategic fears can create a cascade of consequences that spiral far beyond anyone's original intentions. Kaiser Wilhelm did not build the railway to start a war. Georg von Siemens at Deutsche Bank did not want the concession in the first place. Sultan Abdul Hamid wanted to modernize his empire and hold it together. Wilhelm von Pressel, the German engineer who designed the route,
was genuinely bewildered that his railroad had become such an object of international contention. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what the railway represented. To Germany, it represented access, markets, oil, and strategic depth. To Britain, it represented an existential threat to the Suez Canal, to India, to naval supremacy, to the entire architecture of imperial power.
To Russia, it represented a German wall blocking their path to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. To France, it represented a competitor that would siphon trade and influence away from their Levantine holdings. Each power looked at the same set of railroad tracks and saw a different nightmare, and so they armed themselves against it. Britain locked down Kuwait, starved project of capital, and forged alliances with its oldest enemies. Russia swallowed its pride and signed treaties with the British Empire it had spent a century opposing. France joined the alignment out of its own fear of German encirclement. The Triple Entente, the alliance that would define the Allied powers in World War I, was built in large part as a response to a railroad, not to an army, not to a fleet, but to a commercial railway running through the desert. There is a phrase that historians sometimes use when talking about the origins of the Great War. They call it the tragedy of miscalculation. Every power believed it was acting defensively. Germany believed it was simply pursuing its rightful place in the sun, as Kaiser Wilhelm famously put it. Britain believed it was protecting the empire that it had spent centuries building. Russia believed it was safeguarding its southern flank. France believed it was preventing German hegemony over Europe. All of them were right, and all of them were wrong. Because in pursuing their individual security, they created a system of alliances and counter-alliances, of arms races and strategic commitments that made it virtually impossible to contain a local crisis without triggering a continental war. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo in June of 1914, the alliance system that the Baghdad Railway had helped to forge turned a Balkan murder into a global catastrophe. Austria-Hungary mobilized against Serbia, Russia mobilized to protect Serbia, Germany mobilized to support Austria-Hungary, France mobilized to honor its alliance with Russia, and Britain entered the war when Germany invaded Belgium. But the strategic calculations that made British entry inevitable had been shaped by 2 decades of fear, suspicion, and rivalry, rooted in no small part in a German railroad aimed at the Persian Gulf. The Baghdad Railway did not pull the trigger, but it loaded the gun. It was the slow fuse, the quiet accumulation of strategic tension that transformed Europe from a continent of rivalries into a continent at war. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of this story. Wars are rarely started by the things we expect. They are started by trade routes and oil concessions, by banking agreements and engineering projects, by the quiet accumulation of economic power in places that most people never think about. The Baghdad Railway was never completed in time to matter militarily. It never carried a single barrel of Mesopotamian oil to a German port. It never replaced the Suez Canal. It never made Germany the dominant power in the Middle East. But it terrified everyone who thought it might. And that terror was enough. It was enough to redraw the map of alliances, enough to push ancient enemies into each other's arms, enough to create the conditions for a war that killed 20 million people and destroyed 4 empires. A railroad that was never finished helped start a war that never should have happened, and we are still living with the consequences. If this story gave you a new perspective on how the forces of money, industry, and geopolitics shape the world we live in, consider subscribing to the channel. It is the single best way to make sure you see the next one. And if you found value in this, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next one.